Hello, everybody. I'm so pleased to see so many of you here. Well, happy Friday and happy National Distance Learning Week. I'm really excited about the way we are concluding the week here. In a minute, I'll talk a little bit more about the presentation and our presenter. But I wanted to just share with you a little bit about MOLLI, the Maryland Online Leadership Institute. So first, let me introduce myself. My name is Shinta Hernandez, and I am the MOLLI Director. I am also the Dean of MC Online and Academic Support at Montgomery College. I don't know why that's happening there. And I so appreciate that you are spending your hour with us. And for those of you who are just coming in, please write your name in the chat along with your institution and your title. That would be really, really great. So I wanted to give a brief history of MOLLI. For those of you who may not be familiar with this, we provide professional development for online education leadership, and it is continuous learning opportunities all the time. We are a signature program of MarylandOnline, and MarylandOnline, also known as MOL, is a consortium of 19 colleges and universities in the state of Maryland that are focused on promoting and supporting and improving, enhancing online learning and online support throughout the state through continuous professional development and collaboration. So we welcome you here again. Before we get started, let me share with you a few housekeeping. About 10 minutes before the conclusion of this webinar, I will put in the chat a link to the post-webinar survey. We always love feedback. We want to hear from you how things went, but we also want to hear from you additional topics that you might find interesting that MOLLI could consider exploring for future professional development opportunities for online education leaders or leaders in higher ed. So your feedback is important. And I'll also share at the end of the webinar, the MOLLI website that has information on all of the things that we do, information on the remaining webinar that we're gonna have next month, as well as our one of our really well-known programs. It's called the MOLLI Residential Program that is being held next summer, 2025. So please take a look at that website when I put that in the chat. Certainly looking forward to seeing so many of you, if not all of you, in those spaces. All right, so now I have the honor and pleasure of introducing you to our presenter. One of the best in the industry, I will say. So we have here Dr. Van Davis, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of WCET. WCET stands for WCET Cooperative for Educational Technologies. He joined WCET in 2021 as Chief Strategy Officer, where he was responsible for all aspects of WCET's strategic planning, artificial intelligence research, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and assisting the team with policy and research efforts. Dr. Davis has over 25 years of experience in higher education as a faculty member, academic administrator, state policy maker, and EdTech leader. He holds a PhD in 20th century US history with an emphasis in civil rights from Vanderbilt University, and his commitment to education is evidenced in both his professional and personal successes. Additionally, Dr. Davis led the creation of the Texas Adult Degree Complete Project and the development of the first competency-based bachelor's degrees of Texas at Texas Public Institutions of Higher Ed during his time on the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Dr. Davis lives outside of Austin, Texas with his beloved wife, Lisa, and 2 cats, and when not working, spends time collecting Lego models and dreaming of the day he can complete his Western US camping trip. His favorite book is To Kill a Mockingbird. Favorite movie is Dr. Strangelove. And let me end this introduction by saying congratulations to Dr. Davis for his most recent appointment. He will be WCET's Executive Director and WCET's Vice President for Digital Learning starting January 1st, 2025. So first of all, Dr. Davis, congratulations. We are very excited to see WCET under your leadership, and I will just continue following you and all the great work that you're doing. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand this over to Dr. Van Davis.
All right, thank you so much, Shinta. And it is a pleasure to be with you this morning. We have a lot to talk about. I will tell you that I may raise more questions than answers, I'm afraid, because there's a lot that is still in flux after what happened with the general elections on Tuesday. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Let me share my screen real fast, and then we can get started here. There we go. And Shinta, if you wouldn't mind opening up the poll, please. I have a few polling questions I wanted to start us out with.
Absolutely. All right, you should all see 3 questions. And Ben, just let me know when you want me to end the poll.
Sure thing. We've got about 2/3 of you that have responded, so let's give it about 30, 45 seconds more. All right, let's go ahead and close it.
All right, so results are being shared right now.
So I actually am not able to see the responses to number 1. Can you see those, Shinta?
I do after we click on here. I think I might have to share the screen.
Okay, I'll stop sharing so you can do that.
Yeah, it looks like that's what has to happen.
There you go.
Okay, perfect. So when it says view details, it brings me to a different all right. So here it is. These are the results for number 1. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay.
So we have Trump, uncertainty, access for everyone, accessibility, bandwidth, privacy, ethics, lawsuit, changes, concerned, consistency and effectiveness. I love that response. Privacy and ethics, students cheating, not submitting their own work, honesty, ensuring all content and interactions are equitable and accessible. So back to accessibility. Overwhelmed, I can understand that. Conflict of interest and equity with on-campus courses. Okay. And then I noticed with number 2, when we asked on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very worried, how worried are you about the new Title II accessibility regulations? 43% of you were right there in about the middle. One of you is not concerned, one of you is a little concerned. Most of you are moderately concerned, and then 7 of you, 30%, ranked at a 4, and 4 of you, 17%, are very concerned. And then something similar, actually, with the question of on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very worried, how worried are you about the proposed distance ed regulations? So again, most of you are there in the middle, 57%, 12 of you. 1 isn't concerned at all. A couple of you are a little concerned. 4 of you are moderately concerned, and then 2 of you are very concerned. So let me just go ahead and say to the 2 of you that are very concerned, I don't think you will be as concerned at the end of our time today. That is the good news, and I'll explain why here in a moment. That is not the case with accessibility with Title II, and I'll explain why here in a moment as well. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen and we can get started with the presentation. There we go. So what I want to talk to you this morning about is a little bit about the winter 2024 negotiated rulemaking. I want to spend some time talking about Title II accessibility, online program managers and third-party servicers, because there's some things that are likely to happen literally in the next week and a half there. Spend a couple of minutes talking about 2 really critical Supreme Court decisions from earlier this year that's going to significantly impact all of our work in online learning and digital learning. And then talk a little bit about some ethical considerations and offer up an ethical framework for you to have in mind as you're working with digital learning. I want to preface all of this by saying I'm not a lawyer. Despite what my mother wanted, I became a historian and not a lawyer. So I'm not a lawyer. You need to make sure that you're working very carefully with your legal counsel on many of these issues, particularly around accessibility. So I just want to preface that. I am a policy wonk, which means I think about this stuff and I recognize that normal people don't. So we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive here. And we're going to start out by me saying that the sort of overarching symbolism that you're going to see throughout this presentation is choppy waters, because I feel like that's what we're in right now. We are in very confusing and choppy waters for distance education professionals to navigate. And I'm afraid that that navigation is not going to get much easier. It's going to continue to be confusing and choppy for a while longer. And so my hope is that this will help you navigate those waters a little bit more readily. So let's start with the winter 24 negotiated rulemaking. And I'm actually going to start with something called the Congressional Review Act. This is where it gets really wonky. So the Congressional Review Act basically says that with a simple majority of both chambers, Congress can roll back any agency's finalized regulations that take place within 60 legislative days of the seating of the new Congress. So that basically means that any regulations that an incoming Congress doesn't like that have happened within the last 60 legislative days, they have the opportunity with a simple majority to get rid of those regulations. And it's more than just get rid of those regulations. When the Congressional Review Act is used, an agency cannot issue any rule moving forward that is substantially the same. So it is a knockout. It is not only do you roll back those regulations you don't like, but you effectively prevent that agency from ever bringing anything like that forward again. So the Congressional Review Act is a really big deal. And here's why I start with it today. Because during President Trump's first term, he used the Congressional Review Act more than any other president ever has. Now, as of 20 minutes ago, we don't know which party is going to control the House of Representatives. That is still undecided. We know that we have President Trump that will be entering the White House in January, so we'll have a Republican executive branch. We have a Republican Senate. It looks like the Republicans will have 3 or 4 seat majority in the Senate. And then we don't know who's going to control the House yet. If the Republicans win the House, if they maintain control of the House, then the Congressional Review Act comes into play. If for some reason the Democrats are able to flip the House, then the Trump administration will not have the Congressional Review Act to use to roll back regulations. Doesn't mean that they can't roll back regulations, but they would have to roll them back through negotiated rulemaking. They wouldn't be able to immediately eradicate those regulations. That's going to heavily determine what the Department of Education does between now and January. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. The other thing to keep in mind is I said that during his first administration, President Trump's administration used CRA more than any other president had before. And that was in the midst of a fairly disorganized first 6 to 12 months. I think that there is a likelihood that if the Republicans maintain control of the House, that we would see the CRA used even more because there's not going to be quite as much disorganization. It appears that President Trump is going to enter the White House in January of 2025 considerably more organized than he was when he entered in January of 2020. So let's talk a little bit about negotiated rulemaking and how that happens. So negotiated rulemaking is when the Department of Education, and the Department of Education is one of the few regulatory agencies that uses this process. But the negotiated rulemaking is when the Department of Education, it's the process the department uses to craft new regulations. And it starts by issuing a notice of intent. And what that does is it solicits the public comment on the issues to be negotiated. So that notice of intent is, hey, we want to do negotiated rulemaking. This is your opportunity to tell us what sort of regulations we should include in that negotiated rulemaking. After the department does that, it asks and it determines what issues are going to be included in that negotiated rulemaking. Then it calls for nominations. And it has to ask for negotiators from all of the affected parties. Now, the department gets to define who an affected party is. And so they will outline, these are the groups that we want to have a seat at the table, and they'll call for nominations. And then the department chooses who their negotiators are going to be from those nominations. And then the department conducts negotiated rulemaking, or what us policy wonks call neg-reg. Negotiated regulations. And so that usually happens over about a 3-month period. And then at the end of that, the department has one of 2 choices. If all of the negotiators reached consensus around agreed upon language, that means every one of them, it has to be unanimous consensus. So every one of them has to agree. If all of the negotiators agree on the proposed regulatory language, then that's what the department releases as final regulations. That is what they have to put out there for public comment. If there's even one person that disagrees, then the department gets to write whatever regulatory language they want for public comment. And it is highly unusual for all of the negotiators to agree. So effectively what happens is when there is not unanimous consent, and there is almost never unanimous consent, the department gets to go back and it gets to write whatever it wants for the proposed regulations. It takes that language and it releases it in what's called an NPRM, a notice of proposed rulemaking. And then there is 30 days for public comment, or at least it's been 30 days under this Department of Education. And that's all of our opportunity as individuals and as a community to comment on these proposed regulations and tell the department, hey, we like this, we think it's a good idea, or hey, we don't think this is a very good idea, and here's why, and here's how it's going to impact us and impact our students. The department takes all of that. They perhaps make revisions, although this Biden Department of Education has made very few revisions based on public comment. And then it sends that over to the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, for what's called an EO 12866 meeting. That refers to Executive Order 12866. And that's when the Office of Management and Budget and a subdivision within it, OIRA, reviews those proposed regulations, and it gives the public one last time to comment. You can request a 12866 meeting. That's a 30-minute meeting with somebody from the Office of Management and Budget and somebody from the Department of Education, where you can make one last case for why you think these are either a really good idea or a really bad idea. Once OMB signs off, then Ed gets to release final regulations. If the department releases those final regulations by November 1st, then they go into effect on July 1st of the following year. Now, here's why all of this is important. Those distance ed regulations the department released through an NPRM this fall, they missed the November 1st deadline. So those distance ed regulations around attendance, around virtual location, no Title IV for asynchronous clock hour courses, and additional student data on distance education modality, none of those were released in final form on November 1st. So that means even assuming that the Democrats are able to take the House and the Republicans can't use the Congressional Review Act, we're not looking at those regulations next year. They're off the table for next year. There's some speculation as to why the department missed that deadline. According to the department, they're having difficulty responding to all of the public comments that they received, which probably indicates that there were a lot of folks that were not happy with those regulations, those proposed regulations. And as we all know, the department's had some other things on their plate, like fixing FAFSA. This Department of Education, during the first Trump administration, there was a significant departure in career personnel. So the department lost a lot of their staff, and they have never adequately restaffed after that. So there have been challenges around the staffing level, and then there have been challenges around FAFSA. There have been challenges around student loan forgiveness that have taken a lot of the department's energy and attention, and they missed that November 1st deadline. Because they missed that November 1st deadline, one of two things can happen. If the Republicans remain in control of the House, this all goes away, most likely. It would be very foolish, I think, for the department to move forward, because the Republicans could simply use the Congressional Review Act and not only revoke the regulations, but prevent the department, prevent another administration from ever bringing any of this forward again. I don't think that the department will do that. If the Democrats take control of the House and manage to flip it, there is a chance that the department will move forward with these regulations, because it would not be immediately easy for the Trump Department of Education to get rid of them. They would have to go through another round of negotiated rulemaking. They could slow walk them. They could basically ignore them potentially. but they wouldn't be able to immediately get rid of them. And so there is a scenario where the department might decide that these issues are important enough and that they sort of want to gum up the works for a Trump Department of Education, that they go ahead and release them if they can't be revoked under the Congressional Review Act. It's probably going to be another few days before we see what happens with the House of Representatives. So those are the two likely scenarios right now with the distance education regulations. Let me refresh your memory what is at stake there. So the first has to do with attendance taking, or what the department calls attendance taking for distance education courses. You may remember the way that the department ended up defining attendance in that NPRM, in those proposed regulations, was basically that for every student, you would have to find the last, you would have to track the last academic activity that student was engaged in, the last meaningful academic activity that student was engaged in. And then for students that are not completing an academic activity and do not have an excused absence, within 14 days of that last academic activity, you have to start the withdrawal process for that student. So we would have to track, under these proposed regulations, you would have to track whenever a student is completing an academic activity, and then if you don't see them do that for 14 days and they don't have an excused absence, you have to start withdrawing them. There's some serious implications to that, and the department received quite a bit of pushback on this, both from negotiators at the time of the negotiated rulemaking back in January, February, and March, and then also in public comment. Because first of all, it's a significant burden, an administrative burden for institutions. Right now, you don't have to do that. Not all academic activity takes place within the LMS. Even if it should, it doesn't always. And so this would require faculty and staff to do something that they're not currently doing right now and might not be equipped to do very easily. And then the other thing that I think a lot of us had concerns about was that withdrawal within 14 days. Because we all know that, particularly with digital learners, who a lot of times are working adults who are juggling life and education and family and caretaking and a job, at least one job, if not more than one job, that they may not do something for a stretch of time because life has intervened, but are oftentimes able to come back and successfully complete the course. And they also may not know how to navigate our educational bureaucracies to get an excused absence. And so there are some serious implications potentially around attendance taking. One of the other proposed regulations was getting rid of Title IV federal financial aid eligibility for asynchronous clock hour courses. So not credit hour, but clock hour. And I think the concern there is that this regulates purely on the basis of modality. So we are seeing a pattern here of the Department of Education, or at least this Department of Education, singling out the distance education modality as something that needs extra scrutiny. There was the proposed creation of a new location, a virtual location. And I excerpted the proposed regulatory language here that defined what a virtual location was. And the department's rationale for this is twofold. One, they said they want to make sure that students who are enrolled in online programs and courses can access closure benefits if an institution closes all of its distance programs. And that's admirable. The second rationale, I think, is a little bit more concerning. The department wants to collect more data on distance programs, and I quoted them here from the NPRM. Better understand student outcomes, conduct more accurate program oversight, and improve the department's ability to determine the states where Title IV HEA recipients are located. So the department basically is saying here that they want to understand student outcome data for distance education students. And we see that in their rationale for collecting additional modality data as well. The department in the NPRMs, in the proposed regs, proposes that they want to collect data on all students enrolled in a distance education course, which potentially means that you would have to create new reporting mechanisms. So there's some concerns about an administrative staff time that it would take to fulfill this. And I can tell you that the department believes that this is very easy to do. We and others in the distance education community vigorously disagreed with the department in our public comment. We believe that this would take considerable time and effort and financial hit for institutions to be able to do this. But again, we see here that the department is expressing skepticism about the effectiveness and validity of distance education, because their rationale is the proposed addition of a definition of distance education course would enable the department to better assess the effectiveness of distance education and compare its outcomes with those of traditional in-person instruction. Our concern here is that a student's effectiveness, yes, it is impacted by modality, but we all know that the effectiveness and the success of students is impacted by a lot more than modality. And oftentimes our distance education students are our working adult students who are juggling a lot of different things that can positively or negatively impact their success in a way that an 18 to 20-year-old sitting in a classroom on a campus is not dealing with. And so we have some concerns, and I think a number of other folks within the distance education community are concerned here that the department is trying to simplify what constitutes student success and is trying to make an apples to oranges comparison. And again, this is indicative of a department that has appeared to begin to express a great deal of skepticism around distance education and the effectiveness of distance education. There were a couple of other things that were a part of that winter negotiated rulemaking that we no longer have to worry about. One of those was reciprocity. That is likely no longer in play. A Trump Department of Education, at least based on what we saw during his first term, supports the state authorization reciprocity agreement and reciprocity. And so that's likely to not be an issue anymore. One of the other issues that was negotiated but the department had not released proposed regulatory language yet was around inclusive access. They wanted to change inclusive access programs from opt-out programs to opt-in programs, and then very narrowly define the criteria by which an institution could offer an inclusive access program. That is likely out of no longer in play as well. So we don't need, if you have inclusive access programs, I don't think you need to be worried about any regulatory language that's going to negatively impact those programs. So that was the winter negotiated rulemaking. That was winter neg reg. Some of it may still be in play. Some of it we no longer need to worry about, at least for the next 4 years as a community. And then we have the Department of Justice earlier this year released Title II accessibility regulations. These are still in play. These were released early enough that they are not subject to the Congressional Review Act. And so these had an effective date of June 24th. So they're out of that 60 legislative day window. And they basically have either a 2026 or a 2027 compliance date. I think for almost all of you, you're looking at a 2026 compliance date. What they do is they say that if you are a large public entity, and they define large by the size of the population you serve, not your student body, but the population you serve. So if you're a community college, it's the district that you serve. If you are a public university, it's the state of Maryland. And I think based on the conversation I had last week with some of the MarylandOnline folks, I think there may only be one community college in Maryland that would not be a large entity. But basically what these Title II regulations do is they enshrine WCAG 2.1 AA standards into regulations. So you have to now meet, at minimum, the 2.1 level AA standards. There are 5 exceptions. They are incredibly limited exceptions, and we think that they are probably very difficult to prove. The first is you can exempt archived web content that is not currently being used, but you're going to have to prove that it's not being used. You can exempt pre-existing conventional electronic documents unless, and this is a huge unless they are used to apply for, gain access to, or participate in services, programs, or activities. That means anything that you're using in a class, it can no longer be exempted. It is required that those documents meet 2.1 AA requirements. Content posted by a third party, if the party is not acting for the institution. So if you have a student out there that tweets about you and they're not acting on behalf of you, you're okay. But, and this is another big but, if you're using a third party and they're doing something on your behalf, like the learning management system is operating on your behalf, you are responsible now for making sure that that third party vendor is meeting those 2.1 level AA requirements. So just because a third party vendor is doing something for you doesn't absolve you from your responsibility in making sure that it is accessible. It's on you now, not on them, but on you. Individualized password protected documents about a specific individual or pre-existing social media posts. So very limited exceptions. Now, here's something that is still unclear about these regulations. When Justice put the Title II regulations out earlier this year in June, they did not associate penalties with those regulations. So you might not be penalized by justice if you're found not to be in compliance. However, and this is where you really need to be talking with your legal counsel, you do open yourself up for a public lawsuit. And I think that it is probably unlikely that at least initially a court would not find against you if you're not in compliance with these regulations. But here's where you really, really, really need to be talking with your legal counsel now, so that you can make some decisions about what risk you are comfortable with and what risk you are uncomfortable with, because there could be some significant damages if you were sued and found in non-compliance with these regulations. And OPMs, there we go. So online program managers and third-party servicers. If you're not following Phil Hill and Associates, I would highly urge you to do so. This is probably some of the best analysis that is out there around a lot of things in the digital learning space, but especially around third-party servicers and OPMs. So you may remember back in February of 2023, The department issued revised third-party servicer guidance through a Dear Colleague letter. And basically what they did was they significantly expanded what a third-party servicer was, so that it included a lot of things, including learning management system providers, it basically included any vendor that touched any aspect of any course or activity that was associated or funded by Title IV, including things like learning technology. The department got over 1,100 public comments, the overwhelming majority of them basically saying, "What on the earth do you think you're doing? This is insane." The department was not expecting that level of public outrage. Meanwhile, 2U, one of the major OPM providers, sued the Department of Education over third-party servicer guidance. They've gone through a number of different steps in that lawsuit. The department over the last year and a half has said, well, we'll wait to implement. We're going to create an effective date of implementation September 1st, 2023. And then they said, well, we'll revise that guidance and delay its effectiveness. And then they said we'd revise that by September of 2023, and they didn't. And through the 2U lawsuit, the department had to give an update every 90 days saying when they thought that they were going to revise guidance. And they kept saying, well, we'll do it in the next 90 days, and then missing that deadline. Well, we'll do it in the next 90 days, and then missing that deadline. Until finally, late last month, in the 2U court case filing, the department said, we're going to formally rescind that Dear Colleague letter, that February 15th Dear Colleague letter, no later than November 18th, 2023. So that means that February of 2023 Dear Colleague letter, 23-03, that's going to be formally pulled next week sometime. So that goes away. And again, because we're going to be looking at a Republican-controlled Department of Education, which has said that they are very supportive of third-party servicers, that expansion of third-party servicers is not something we need to worry about anymore. However, we do need to talk about online program managers and OPMs. So you may remember back in 2011, a long time ago, the department issued a Dear Colleague letter that basically said that it created a bundled service exemption to the ban on incentive compensation. So it basically said that a OPM can be paid per student through a revenue share agreement, basically, if they are bundling services together. If they are, say, bundling recruitment services and assistance with developing academic content, or recruitment services and managing program implementation. Now, in that February 2023 letter, the department talked about potentially rescinding this exemption. It's still there, and there's discussion that the department has been making murmurs before Tuesday that they were going to rescind the 2011 letter. Yesterday, Representative Virginia Fox, who heads the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, Representative Fox, who is a Republican, a prior community college president, sent a letter to Secretary of Education Cardona saying, we have heard rumors that you plan to rescind the third-party bundled, that you plan to rescind the bundle services exemption. We don't think you should do that, because you well know that a Republican administration supports OPMs. And we think that it is abusing your power to do this on the way out the door. Now, Secretary Cardona can do it if he wants. There's nothing that prevents him from doing it. Rescinding regulations is not subject to the Congressional Review Act. If the department chooses to do that, then what's most likely to happen is that a Trump Department of Education would come in and do negotiated rulemaking around OPMs, and would just write new regulatory language that allows for the bundled services exemption to stand. But we're not sure what's going to happen with the OPMs yet. The other thing that we're starting to see happening, and this has happened actually with one of your institutions in Maryland, Global Campus, University of Maryland's Global Campus, is we have started to see consumer protection advocates who are very adamantly opposed to OPMs. We started to see those consumer protection advocates who now are challenging OPMs in state court and federal court. Rather than trying to go through the Department of Education, they're challenging them in the courts, and they're getting states to pass legislation, such as the legislation that was passed in Minnesota outlawing OPMs within a state. So we could still see some movement here. And then real quickly, there are two other factors at work here with the Supreme Court. Earlier this year, there were two court cases. One is called Loper-Bright. Loper-Bright overturned the Chevron doctrine. What the Chevron doctrine did was it said that basically you deferred to an agency to determine the statutory authority if the federal statute was ambiguous or silent. So basically what that meant was an agency could write regulations if the statute was ambiguous, and the courts should defer to the agency to do that. That was overturned. And so the Chevron doctrine is no longer in effect. Deference is no longer in effect. And that means agencies are really going to have to justify their regulations. And that's going to be much more closely scrutinized outside of the agency and especially within the courts. And then there was another there was another court case called Corner Post, which changed the statute of limitations. So originally, the way statute of limitations for federal cases was written was you had 6 years to basically sue after the regulation was finalized. That's gone now. You have 6 years to sue once you are injured by the regulation. So that 6-year statute of limitations is effectively out the door. And what that basically means is it greatly expands who can sue. So that's a lot of information at you. Here's the bottom line. Our North Star needs to be doing right by all students. And there are some things that I think we should think about when we do that. I think that we need to think about transparency. We need to think about how our implementation of regulations is just and fair and embraces equity. We need to think about non-malfeasance. We need to make sure that our implementation of regulations does no ill. We need to be responsible and accountable. We need to constantly be thinking about student data privacy. And we need to be thinking about accessibility. Accessibility is probably not going to go away for starters, but it's the right thing to do because we also all know that universal design for learning doesn't just help those students that need accommodations, it helps all students. So the best my crystal ball, my magic 8 ball can tell you is that we'll know next week what happens. Because a lot of this now count is going to be determined by what happens with the House of Representatives and whether or not the Democrats flip it or the Republicans stay in control. The other unknown in all of this is the Trump administration has said that they want to do away with the Department of Education. I will say that that would be incredibly difficult to do legally. That would take congressional action, and it's not clear that a lot of Republican lawmakers even want to do that. But the Trump administration can significantly cut funding to the department and really hobble its ability to do its work. So that's the other big unknown, is what's going to happen with the Department of Education. So a lot to be determined in the next 2 to 3 months. We've got a few minutes for questions that I'm happy to try to answer.
Thank you so much, Van. And there is a question for you. There's a question in the chat, and a couple of questions actually. So let me just go in order.
Okay.
Earlier, you were talking about some of the proposed regulations, specifically on attendance taking requirements. And so there's a question, just a confirmation question from Dana Gullo. So we don't have to track attendance now, if I am understanding correctly.
Correct. Right now, the way that it works is if at the end of the term you see that it appears that a student has disengaged and withdrawn without formally withdrawing, you have to go back and find their last date of their last academic activity, and that's the effective withdrawal date. So you do that at the end of the term right now for those students that appear to have dropped off the face of the earth. The proposed regulations would have required you to keep tracking that constantly for every student.
Okay, great. Thank you,
And
Van.
work with your financial aid office, because they're very familiar with the way that you do that.
Super, thank you. And there's another question here from Rachel Becker. As a student who has learning accommodations, how can I advocate for equitable education and continuation of accessibility?
I think that there's a couple of things. I think one of the first things is making sure that faculty, especially faculty, understand how important those accommodations are for student success. I say this as a recovering historian and a former faculty member for a decade. I don't know any faculty member that doesn't want their students to be successful and succeed, especially faculty at community colleges. I mean, your reason for existence is that you want students to be successful. So I think helping faculty understand how important accommodations are for guaranteeing not just that student's success, but oftentimes how important it is for helping all students succeed is really critical. And then I think advocating for those students and advocating for institutions to really provide the support that is needed in those students of your offices of student accessibility. And then making sure, and I'm pretty sure this is probably already happening, making sure that your instructional design staff support are really aware of what universal design for learning looks like, because that can help a lot with making sure that particularly digital learning is accessible for all students.
Thank you, Van. Wonderful. So we have another question for you. For this, okay, so will you be planning an updated webinar on these topics soon?
So one of the great things that WCET does, Mike's put one of the things in there. We've got a listserv. MarylandOnline is a part, so many of you should be able to access the listserv that you can subscribe to. So that's one thing. But the other thing, even if your institution isn't a part of WCET, we do a blog series called Frontiers, and that's open to everyone. And we do a tremendous amount of federal regulatory analysis in Frontiers. And so I can guarantee you that we're already looking at Frontiers posts. Once we have a better handle on what actually is going to be going on, we'll probably do a webinar in the spring once things have settled down. And if you're going to be at the Online Learning Consortium meeting in a couple of weeks, myself and Russ Poulin, who's the current executive director and probably knows more about digital learning, federal regulations than anyone else alive, including anyone at the Department of Education, and then Shel Dow, who's the director of the State Authorization Network, are going to be doing 3 sessions, including a featured session at OLC about federal regulations, reciprocity, professional licensure, the distance ed regulations, and then why are so many people questioning the value of digital learning these days?
Yeah, wonderful. And I also put in the chat the website to WCET. So when you click on that, you'll see a plethora of information that I'm
Yes.
sure you will find useful. So peruse that website when you get a chance. And one more, Van, for you, and this is more a statement. So Dr. Cynthia Edwards says that she has an issue. Students in her online classes do not have computers at work, speaker does not work, screen does not work, and so on. And so it's just expressing frustration with that.
I completely understand that frustration, and when I was teaching, shared that frustration with you. I think that we are aware that the digital divide is still, unfortunately, alive and well. The pandemic showed us that. I mean, we knew that before the pandemic, but we continue to have challenges with students having adequate equipment. We continue to have challenges with students having adequate access to broadband devices. A lot of our students are, taking their coursework on mobile devices, and that may be the only thing that they have. And we don't, as a rule, design our coursework for mobile devices. And so that's a very real problem that we need to address as a community. I wish I had a magic answer for how to address that, though. And unfortunately I don't, but we know that that's a challenge for many of our students, and it's the dirty little secret that we need to talk about.
Well, thank you so much, Van. Is there any last minute advice that you can give all of us as we kind of navigate through these very choppy waters, as you had mentioned earlier?
Follow frontiers. We are very serious about making sure that not just our members, but all of the distance education and digital learning community understands what's going on. I think we probably track this stuff more closely than anybody else out there. And so I would say follow frontiers, because we will be doing a lot of that analysis in the next few months. And you can always reach out to me. I'm always happy to answer questions, or at least point you in the direction of answers if I don't have that myself.
We are so very appreciative of your wealth of knowledge and your time and availability to share that with us. This was an incredibly timely and informative webinar. So thank you so much, Van, for allowing us in your space.
Sure, happy to help out. Y'all take care.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Please don't forget to fill out the feedback survey and check out all the other MOLLI events that are coming up. Thanks so much.